This hideous monster grabs an adult man and stuffs him into its own pocket. It breaks the man's limbs until it can zip up the bag. Parents warn their children to beware of the legendary bagman. If you misbehave, you will be shoved into his filthy, rotting bag and never be able to return to your parents. The protagonist Pat once escaped this fate in his childhood. Back then, he and his brother Liam ignored their father's warnings and ventured into a mine because adults said there was a bagman who snatched children here. They wanted to find out if the legend was true. Soon after arriving at their destination, they regretted it. They were about to turn back when Pat spotted a wild plum tree. His grandfather had said this wood was precious, and Pat was an avid carving enthusiast. He instantly cast aside his fear and walked toward the cave entrance. Just as Pat was desperately cutting the wood, the legendary bagman quietly approached and even snipped off a lock of his hair. Now, Pat has grown up, started a family, and has his own child Jack, along with his caring wife Karina. But the experiences of his childhood left him with lasting scars. Recently, due to work-related reasons, Pat moved back to his hometown entirely. Returning to the old place made him on edge. That night, Pat heard strange noises coming from the woods. He grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. He discovered a large rat with glowing red eyes. It looked like some kind of mutant species. Pat hurried back to the yard. He lived in constant fear, fearing that one day, the bagman would suddenly appear and snatch away his precious son Jack. Karina was unaware of her husband's worries. At this moment, she was working in the yard. Jack was playing the recorder non-stop, which made Karina very irritated. She scolded Jack to be quiet. She continued to focus on her work. Suddenly, Jack heard the laughter of a child. A boy flashed by. Jack chased after him into the back forest. By the time Karina looked up from her computer, she realized her son was missing. She quickly ran into the forest to look for him. As Jack chased the boy, he went further and further away. Fortunately, Karina soon heard the sound of the recorder. She found her son next to a large tree. Just as she was about to carry Jack away, she heard strange noises coming from the top of the tree. In the evening, Karina told Pat about what had happened during the day. She felt very guilty about her negligence. The two stared at the baby monitor screen, knowing full well that they could not lose their son. Pat wanted to move his family away, but the bank's collection notices were chasing him down. He couldn't find investors for the project he was working on. Pat was getting frustrated at his computer desk when he suddenly heard his son's laughter from the monitor.
Hey, who you talking to, buddy?
Daddy.
Pat carefully checked all the doors and windows again. The lighting in the house suddenly malfunctioned, and there were loud banging noises coming from downstairs. He hurried down to investigate the sounds. He discovered that the laundry room window had been left open. Pat pulled hard on the window, but strange noises came from outside once more. In the middle of the night, he nervously gazed out the window, with a baseball bat clutched in his hand. Karina, seeing this, felt a bit frightened, and asked him what he was doing up at this hour.
Just listen.
What am I listening for?
This weird zipping sound.
There was a thud coming from Jack's room, accompanied by the sound of the child crying. Pat hurried to grab Jack. He handed Jack over to his wife to take care of, and took the baseball bat downstairs to check. He tightened his nerves as he checked each room. When he suddenly heard the back door creak, Pat rushed into the yard to look for someone.
I'm right here!
The strange sound of zippers was incessant. Pat felt as if he had returned to his childhood, almost consumed by the fear inside him. He didn't have the courage to chase into the forest to investigate. The next morning, the police arrived after receiving a report. The sheriff speculated that someone had seen the overgrown yard and thought you were out of town. So they tried to take advantage of the darkness to steal, but Pat's home hadn't lost a dime. The intruder was likely not just a simple thief. Just then, a young officer discovered something. He called the sheriff and Pat to the window. There were many carvings scattered on the roof. These were all works from Pat's childhood. They must have come from boxes that were originally piled in the garage. Someone must have deliberately thrown them onto the roof to lure Jack inside the house. The young officer quickly bagged the carvings as evidence. Pat and his wife followed the sheriff's instructions to check everything in the house. Unexpectedly, he found, by chance, in the trash can, the owl carving from decades ago. This had originally fallen at the mine entrance. Karina urged Pat not to think too much about it, and then quietly handed him their son's recorder. She asked Pat to find a place to throw it away quickly. Jack played with this thing every day. It was driving her to the brink of a nervous breakdown. In the afternoon, while Jack was taking a bath, he fussed about looking for his recorder. Fortunately, Pat hadn't thrown the flute away yet. He told his son to behave and finish his bath, and went to the shed to get the recorder. Along the way, Pat kept calling out to his son, checking to make sure he was still in the bathroom. A stranger knocked on the bathroom window. Jack affectionately called him Dolly. Meanwhile, Pat noticed the flute was missing. He shouted Jack's name loudly, but the little boy didn't respond. Pat hurried upstairs to check, but the intruder had already slipped away quickly.
Who are you playing with?
That night, Pat searched through the trash can, but couldn't find the recorder. The couple lay in bed wide awake, so they brought their son into the master bedroom to sleep with them. Around 4 in the morning, Pat's phone suddenly received a notification text. The home security alarm system had inexplicably shut down. He quickly got up and went downstairs to restart it. He heard something moving in the shed. Pat cautiously went over to check. He turned on his flashlight to inspect the surroundings. Next to a pile of boxes sat a child. Pat picked it up and saw it was a doll, wearing the same kind of hat he had on the day he went to the mine. Pat was startled, but didn't think much of it. He closed the shed door and prepared to head back inside. He found that the front door had inexplicably locked itself. Pat went around to the side to get the spare key. The space under the flower pot was empty. He had to squeeze through a small door to turn the doorknob. Pat glanced into the living room without thinking. He saw someone hanging upside down from the ceiling, holding Jack's recorder in their hands. Pat hurriedly smashed the window to get out, but the figure in the black robe had vanished. Karina woke up and came out holding their son. Pat urged them to quickly get inside and lock the door. He searched the house for the intruder, but, of course, found nothing. The next day, the police conducted another thorough search. They found no fingerprints from outsiders on the doors or windows, aside from the wooden recorder. Nothing else had been taken from the home. The sheriff was truly at a loss. Pat took the owl carving to find Liam. He explained that this should have been lost at the mine, but had ended up in his trash can, and the hat on the doll in the shed was the same one he had thrown away years ago. Liam understood what Pat was trying to say, that the bagman from their childhood had returned, but he didn't agree with his brother's perspective. He also suggested that Pat see a psychologist. Meanwhile, Jack suddenly handed his mother a gift. He said, "This is from Dolly." Karina opened it to take a look, and saw a drawing of Pat cutting the wild plum tree. The back depicted Karina, as she looked at this moment, from the perspective in the drawing. The creator was hiding in the nearby circular slide. Karina rushed over, and saw a figure in a black robe, standing in front of her son, but the facilities here were for children, and Karina's size prevented her from getting inside. She could only anxiously wait outside. The figure in the black robe pulled out a ragged bag, with a terrifying smile on his face. In the next moment, Pat woke up from the dream. Now, the couple was on the brink of collapse. They went to see a psychologist together. The doctor was an old acquaintance of Pat's. She had been the one helping Pat with his psychological counseling back then. Now, bringing up old matters triggered many unpleasant memories for Pat. His father had once said that the bagman preferred children with dreams and aspirations, rather than bad children. Once someone caught the bagman's interest, he would relentlessly pursue them, until he stuffed the desired child into his bag. The psychologist believed they were too anxious about their child, which caused them to project their inner fears into supernatural phenomena. She suggested that the couple temporarily leave their child with relatives for a day, so they could relax and enjoy their time together. They shouldn't pressure themselves too much. Following the doctor's advice, they tried to unwind, but Karina couldn't help but ask what had really happened in the mine back then. Pat mentioned that the bagman had cut off a lock of his hair. It was said that as long as this lock of hair existed, no matter where the target fled, the bagman would always be able to find him. But his father had also told Pat that no matter how powerful or cunning the bagman was, he also had weaknesses. Every child has something they loved most in their childhood, like Pat's carving knife and Jack's recorder. These cherished items imbued with a child's love could wield great power at critical moments. As long as they held onto such things, they could be protected from the bagman's harm. The problem was that Jack's recorder was missing, which made Pat especially worried about him. Meanwhile, Aunt Anna heard some static from the baby monitor, but Jack was sound asleep in his bed. There was nothing unusual in the room. After contacting the security office to confirm safety repeatedly, the lighting in the room suddenly malfunctioned, and her phone crashed as well. Then, a series of knocks echoed at the door. Anna grabbed her pepper spray and cautiously approached the door. She peeked through the peephole and saw the bagman. Even worse, the door bolt suddenly shifted on its own. The security chain was also released by someone. Anna hurried back to the room and hid with Jack in the closet. She held a kitchen knife, watching the outside. The silhouette of the bagman swept by. In the next moment, he yanked open the closet door and caught Anna, who was trying to sneak attack. Anna fainted the moment she was touched. Meanwhile, the bagman pulled back the blanket, only to find that Jack was not in bed. Soon after, the police and Pat and his wife arrived at the scene. Although Anna had scratches on her face from the bagman, both she and Jack were unharmed. The police checked the apartment's surveillance footage, but the corridor cameras were malfunctioning at the time of the incident. Fortunately, the doorman noticed something was off and called for help, which scared the bagman away. The sheriff stated there had been a similar case 4 years ago. A girl named Emily had mysteriously disappeared on the day of the incident. Her father, like Anna, had experienced temporary paralysis and loss of speech. He also had strange scratches on his face. It seems that causing paralysis and numbness, it is the bagman's special ability. The police would send officers to protect Pat's family, to prevent a tragedy from happening again. But the unexpected quickly occurred. That night, Pat and his family stayed at his brother's house. The surveillance camera malfunctioned. For no reason, Pat rushed to the room to check and found Liam lying on the floor, frothing at the mouth. The bagman hurriedly fled, clutching a bag from which Jack's cries for help were coming. Pat chased him all the way outside, only to notice that the police were also collapsed on the ground. He had no choice but to run after the bagman alone. Unexpectedly, the bagman ran back to the familiar mine. Pat found himself back in the place he feared most deep down, but he didn't hesitate for a moment, because he couldn't let anyone harm his son. Pat followed the sounds of his son's cries for help and squeezed into the narrow entrance. Unexpectedly, inside was a different world altogether. Countless candles flickered on the walls, and beneath each cluster of flames lay a precious item belonging to a child. He pulled aside a curtain hanging on the stone wall and saw the filthy large bag. Pat hurriedly unzipped it to check, only to find it contained a puppet. As soon as the gears were turned, Jack's cries for help would echo out. Pat suddenly realized he had been deceived. The bagman had intended to capture him all along, not Jack. Pat shouted provocatively at the bagman, challenging him to come out if he dared. A hand suddenly grabbed Pat. In the next moment, the bagman crawled out from the narrow crevice. He had been thinking about Pat all these years, but Pat had always carried that small carving knife, so the bagman couldn't find an opportunity to strike, until the day the bank sent a bill. Angered, Pat threw away the carving knife, which gave the bagman the chance he needed. Plus, he fed on people's fear, so he had been scaring Pat for days. At this moment, the bagman proudly pulled out the carving knife and slowly opened his large bag. Just at that critical moment, Pat reached out and grabbed a nearby knife and plunged it into the bagman's side neck. The bagman was struck by the precious item, and his energy rapidly diminished. He quickly darted into a crevice in the stone wall. Pat got up, intending to leave the mine, still clutching the recorder he had found there. With the exit so close in sight, the bagman suddenly dropped down, pinning Pat down. Pat struggled to throw him off, and then hurled the recorder out of the mine. He knew he might not be able to escape, but at least he wanted to leave something for his son.
Come on!
In the end, the bagman stuffed Pat into his large bag. When Karina and the police arrived at the scene, they only found Jack's recorder. Karina found it hard to overcome the grief of losing her husband, but for her son, she had to pull herself together. The mother and son soon left the town, and Pat's love would forever accompany that recorder, always guarding Jack. The film ends here. Overall, it follows a fairly neat formula, belonging to the type of traditional horror film that you can predict the subsequent developments from the start. The only twist is that the bagman only wanted to capture Pat all along. The atmosphere built in the first half was decent, but unfortunately, the latter part fell short, resulting in a lack of tension in the final showdown. Fortunately, the legendary bagman's concept is quite novel, including the idea of Guarding children's cherished items, these interesting cultural elements somewhat compensate for the hollow script. If you enjoy my channel, please click subscribe.